I've spent a lot of time thinking about how cards move around if you shuffle them, and then actually writing a lot of simulations to verify that my intuition made any sense.
You know what it never was? That serious. It was never that serious. Quite frankly, will never be that serious.
Okay, let's do it. How do you feel about it? Do you feel like it's in a political...
Yeah, it looks great. It's fantastic. I think it's been in publishable state for a very long time.
How about that?
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. Welcome to a brand new year and a brand new episode of Lucky Paper Radio. I know it's quite a ways into the new year, but this is the first time we're recording in the new year. My name is Andy. I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony, the Tofu King of Baltimore, Maddox.
Tofu, it's so exciting. It deserves air horns.
You said it wasn't really worth making it yourself, is what the outcome was.
Here's what I'll say about making tofu from scratch is so far, yeah, it seems like it's not enough better than store-bought tofu to really be worth it, but what I'm interested in is making tofu with some alternative beans and maybe some other variations.
Alt beans?
Alt bean
You're going to go on
tofu?
an alt bean journey?
So, yeah, I mean, I'm not interested in doing it from scratch just to do, like, your basic everyday tofu, but it was kind of fun. It's kind of this cool process of you add a coagulant and it all curdles up, and it's a lot of cleaning, though. That's really where all the labor is. It's just cleaning and like strainers and a blender. It's all kinds of equipment.
Yeah. You said you could actually, like, it tasted a little bit
Maybe,
better?
but you know, brains are super biased, and when you, like, spend an hour and a half doing a thing to be like, that's literally the same, that's a little bit hard to do.
Yeah, the flavor of tofu. What is the flavor of tofu?
It's very mild. So I haven't actually, I'd like tasted some of it. I'm going to cook the block of tofu today. We'll see. Maybe
What
it
if
just
it tastes
like
way
soaks
better
up flavor.
cooked?
It's
Yeah.
really good. Maybe.
Yeah. Well, cool. Cool food journey you're on.
It is really also fun just to be like, here's this thing that I think of as just, you get it at store, and it's like, no, you can just make that, and it's just like, it's made of dry ingredients you can keep in the pantry.
Yeah, you can make almost all the things.
You can make lots of things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there was somebody
Like,
actually...
what couldn't you make
What couldn't you make?
reasonably or semi-reasonably in a home kitchen that you consider to be like a staple?
Rice.
Okay, I don't mean ingredients.
The soybeans.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's a good question. Maybe other people have some ideas of what are the limits of culinary home kitchen. I feel like I should have more ideas right off the top of my head because Dave Arnold, who I listen to his podcast Cooking Issues, does all kinds of crazy stuff.
Dave Arnold, go on
So
Lucky Paper Radio.
I should have more of these examples. It was really funny. At some point, he was actually on another podcast I was listening to, and he was talking about like, oh yeah, I really like using this certain kind of flour, and it's like really good for this, and he has this like really animated personality, getting really excited about this flour. And then the host of that podcast was like, well, that sounds really exciting. Like, where do people get it? And he just deflated immediately and was just like, oh, yeah, you can't just go get this stuff. Like, you have to, like, buy a flour mill and, meet a farmer that has the kind of wheat that you like and make it from scratch. And it's, like, this really complicated process. So, I don't know. He's a person that really pushes the limits of what you can do in your home kitchen from scratch.
Well, we'll have to have him on and ask him what he thinks the limits of a home kitchen practically is. Anthony, this episode is one we've been talking about for a little while that I think is going to be a good little topic. We are talking about broad changes in Magic card design, and I think specifically like detailed changes in Magic card design over time, and the implications on drafting and gameplay of both. That might sound a little bit weird and abstract. Let me give you an example. One of the things we're going to talk about today, probably one of the later things we'll cover, is the difference between attack triggers on a creature when it itself attacks, so, when this creature attacks, do something, versus a newer pattern we've seen more of, which is creatures that have a whenever you attack trigger. They reward you for attacking with anything. It doesn't have to be the creature that has the ability itself attacking. There's a different texture to those play patterns, and I think we've seen in recent years Wizards move further towards more whenever you attack triggers and fewer whenever this creature attacks triggers. Maybe we can get Magic the Gathering data science to actually make little graphs of these things over time so we can quantify the trends. But I think it's pretty safe to say there is definitely a trend in less of the former and more of the latter. And we got a couple of things we're going to talk about like that.
Yeah, this topic seems really interesting because I feel like, not necessarily in a quantitative or quantifiable sense, but in a qualitative sense, a lot of cards just look different than a card that feels similar that would have been printed a couple years ago. And like that's the nugget that really struck me, is like, oh yeah, if they printed this card 5 years earlier, I think it would have been slightly different in a way that does impact the kind of decisions that you're making around playing with it in a game. But obviously it's also a little bit of a fluffy topic, like the idea that Magic cards are different now. It's like, well, of course, they've printed 3 new mechanics every set 4 times a year. And like, we have Enter the Dungeon now. Like, of course we didn't have that 6 years ago,
Right.
whatever. So I don't know, is there a specific place that you draw the line in what these kinds of things are that you're interested in?
Yeah, I'm not interested in talking about like new mechanics or, new card designs just in a vacuum. I think it's specifically when we can see that they used to do this thing mostly one way and now they do it mostly another way that is most interesting to me. And I think we should tackle these in kind of like roughly chronological order. And when I was thinking of examples and we were talking about it before the episode, the oldest one I can think of that we can see a very clear change in Magic R&D from is the move from effects being on spells to those effects being on creature ETBs or like other permanents, right? Like in early Magic, in the first few sets, like creatures don't have ETBs. You have a creature. The creature's value is the creature itself. And if you look at any modern Magic set, or even going back 20 years, so this is an early change in Magic R&D, tons of creatures have Enter the Battlefield abilities now. And I mean, you could even say that like in most sets, you don't get a bounce spell that's an instant or sorcery, but you get a bounce creature, right? Like that's just a lot more common these days than an actual bounce spell.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually really funny when you go back and look at Alpha. I'm always surprised by how many things were already present from the beginning. Like, oh yeah, there's already artifacts, and there's already tokens were in Alpha, and all kinds of other details. It feels like Richard Garfield just did a really thorough job of coming up with a bunch of different things that Magic cards could do, and then those got revisited and sort of built out in more thoroughly in terms of building a mechanic for a whole set. One of the things that was not there was creatures with Enter the Battlefield abilities, and these are now just a staple. They're just like the way that Magic works is so many creatures have, well, very few creatures are vanilla creatures, and all the rest either have a static ability or something they do when they come in play, or sometimes maybe an activated ability. But really the Enter the Battlefield abilities seem like some of the most prominent. And again, going back to what this affects is sort of the texture of gameplay and the kinds of games that you're playing.
Yeah, and I think I'm really mostly talking about Enter the Battlefield abilities here, or I guess kind of leave the Battlefield abilities, but stuff, I think things that give you value, whether or not you get to untap with the creature or like get to use the creature in any meaningful way over time, are the things that are kind of belonging to this category. I think if we had to map the like moment this change is most obvious in Magic R&D, to me it's Flametongue Kavu. Flametongue Kavu is the earliest like really powerful creature with a good ETB that shaped, constructed, and became a staple in a lot of formats that I think probably was the tipping point for this being such a popular pattern moving forward. There was stuff before that, right? Like Alex plays striped bears in the oldest school cube, which is just a 4-mana 2/2 that ETBs draws a card, and it's great in that cube. It's really, really strong.
Striped bears is kind of broken in this specific cube.
Striped bears. So, I mean, your creatures did exist, but it was like, it was an odd thing here and there, the same way that it was like that was a unique card. Striped Bears was unique. It wasn't an emblematic of a pattern of a broader sort of R&D thing. And I think Flametongue Kavu and its ilk kind of was the tipping point where we see this a lot more.
Yeah, I think the literal first was in Visions, which was Necrotal, which is 5 years after the first Magic set was released. And when was Flametongue Kavu printed? Not until...
Yeah, I guess really Necrotal and Manowar in Visions were kind of like the OG ETB creatures.
And Flametongue Kavu was printed much later, not until 2001, so pretty deep into the game's history.
I guess it took a little while for them to really settle on this being the direction they want the game to go in, producing the kinds of games they feel are like dynamic and interesting games of Magic. So let's talk about what this means from a like draft and gameplay perspective, because a lot of our listeners are cube designers and they get to choose whether or not they put Unsummon or Manowar in their cube, and there are reasons you might want one or the other. I think the reason we see these creatures with Enter the Battlefield abilities be so common these days is because it is a way to kind of get more stuff in your deck, right? You only have 40 cards, you only have the 23 non-land spells you get to put in your deck, and if you want to have some removal and some threats and some card draw and some other stuff, just kind of having a card do two things means that your deck does more, which means that you've got a little more consistency. You're like more likely to have a creature in play to attack and block with, more likely to have, a little bit of interaction or have drawn a card. So it kind of like smooths things out, I think, as opposed to having a deck that is just, all right, I've got my 14 creatures and then my, 7 interactive spells and, a couple of card draw spells or something. Like, those kinds of decks have a much higher chance of just drawing all their interaction, and then they just have no threats on board and can't pressure their opponent's life total, or just not drawing any of their interaction, and then they have to rely only on the creatures they drew. So I think that's the main benefit of these cards, is that they just do more, and they kind of smooth out the game and give you access to more of what your deck can do in more circumstances. Does that make sense to you?
It does. I mean, I would say even more broadly, it's just part of a big change that happened, fairly early in Magic, where they kind of made a decision to make Magic more about creatures and really make that the key resource, the key axis that games revolve around. There's an awesome post that I think this was on Reddit years ago, where Richard Garfield was talking about early Magic and saying, that's kind of not what he had envisioned. He had thought there would be more varied decks that were really focused on artifacts or really focused on just casting spells, and a creature deck was only one of the things out of a bigger sort of palette of things that he really wanted to capture about what is a wizard battle really all about. And at some point, Wizards of the Coast said, we're going to power creep Sarah Angel. Like, Sarah Angel was the best creature for a long, long time. Maybe I shouldn't commit to a statement like that.
No, if you think Anthony's wrong, comment down below. That's engagement,
please
baby.
Don't. But at some point they said, we can just make better creatures. But it wasn't, I think, I would love to have somebody who has a little bit more historical context on this kind of moment in Magic's history come on and talk about this more with us. But I think that there was some hesitation there. Like, do we actually want to be making creatures better and making the game more about creatures? And some people will look at old Magic and say, like, oh yeah, creatures sucked back then, as if Wizards hadn't figured it out yet and hadn't figured out how to make creatures good. No, it was a thing that was deliberate about Magic being more about a variety of different strategies, and they felt it was reasonable to change that. And I don't totally know where I fall personally on that spectrum, or on that how much I think that was a great decision, because my main cube is very much all about creatures. It's all about playing to the board and sort of the decisions you make in combat. Like, this is a part of Magic that I really enjoy, and I think there's a lot of nuance and complexity and interesting decisions about the combat step. But on the other hand, I do really appreciate abstractly, more like narratively, that vision of having strategies that were more varied and cared more about different card types.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And, for my part, I think that creature combat is one of the most brilliant things about Magic. The simplicity of the individual game pieces of, I have a 2/2, I have a 2/3, and you have a 4/1 and a 2/1 flyer, right? Like, the simplicity of those individual game pieces and the incredible depth and complexity that comes from how you attack and block, I think is part of the baseline brilliance of Magic. It also guarantees that all of your game pieces are fundamentally interactive with each other, because attacking and blocking is fundamentally interactive.
Yeah.
As opposed to being here's my mill deck that's based on a bunch of spells, and there's your artifact deck that does whatever, some artifact combo, and it's all right, now we're just ships passing in the night. Our decks just kind of ignore each other and try and do their thing. And making everything about creatures, I think, guarantees some degree of sort of back and forth or interaction between your game pieces. So I think it was inevitable and smart that they made creatures matter more. I do think it's worth noting that there are multiple ways they could have done that. They could have just made all the creatures much more efficient, just, doubled all the power and toughness of everything. All of a sudden, the game is a lot more about creatures, regardless of whether they have enter the battlefield abilities or not. But the way they chose to do it, it was instead largely giving them more abilities. They do more stuff instead of just being more efficient and more powerful, thus making it the dominant kind of strategy in the game.
Yeah, that is a great point. At some point, I even was curious about that and graphed what is the average power and toughness of creatures over time, and it hasn't really changed as much as you might expect if you're thinking, if you're very aware of kind of the power creep that really has happened. And it turns out that they've just been pretty consistent. A 2/3 for 2 is not unreasonable now, whereas it would have been really, really powerful in early Magic, but it's still a 50% increase, not a 300% increase like you might see in some other card games.
We had Mog Flunkies back then. It just had a bunch of downsides as opposed to having a bunch of upsides now.
So it's just that the abilities that the creatures just do more stuff, whether that's with ETBs or static effects or activated abilities, that just mean creatures are a lot better now.
Honestly, it feels like the first step was all right, creatures were just creatures initially. Then there were creatures that were just creatures still, and then creatures that were mostly there for their abilities. And I think we're kind of in a new era now where they've realized actually, when you give a creature cool abilities, you don't have to make its power and toughness awful. One of the hallmarks of my old school cube is there's a lot of 5-mana 2/2s, because back in the day, if you had a 5-mana creature with a good ability, it was on a 2/2. And I feel like these days that would be like a 3-4 or even higher in sort of modern Magic design sensibilities, because I think people have realized that if it's got a relevant ability and it costs 5 mana, it's probably going to eat a removal spell more than actually being a problem attacking and blocking. Like, it doesn't actually change the texture that much to make it a little better in terms of its like vanilla stats.
Yeah, I think that where I've seen this most starkly is with people that design Kamigawa-themed cubes, because for some reason just the difference between Neon Dynasty and old Kamigawa sets is really, really visible, where you see,
oh yeah,
here's a 4-mana card that has an awesome
Kabuto
ability.
Moth was a huge bomb
For
in
sure.
original Kamigawa.
And you might be really excited about some of those old 4 and 5 drops, but then you put them next to the new ones and they just don't get played, which is kind of a disappointment. And I mean, that's where I see the power
Kiki-Jiki
creep.
would get played. That's a 5-mana 2/2.
Okay, Kiki-Jiki's cool. Kiki-Jiki can still hang. But I think that that's where I do see the power creep as a real downside, is for cube designers, like specifically when you're trying to play with cards
Just for
from
us.
different eras and like have those cards be in dialogue with each other, to use a Zach Barish term, is a limitation. But yeah, I mean, we are a pretty niche population among all Magic players. I think another thing that you said in there that's pretty valuable is that there is a limitation to the more varied gameplay, like decks that care about more different card types and like very different themes, is it's much more likely you have decks that just don't interact with each other. It's like, well, your deck is all about killing me with this, like, discard spells and this artifact. If I don't have artifact removal, like, our decks don't really make sense together. So focusing the gameplay on Murderer is always going to be a relevant card does kind of, make more of the deck interactions make sense.
We got to pick up the pace a little bit, because there's a lot of other, I think,
or we could
knock-on
just
effects.
talk about this the whole time.
I mean, we could. We've kind of already
the title
done
of
that,
the
I think, at some
episode.
point. I don't know. There's other knock-on effects, though, I think, to choosing to run, spells that just have an effect versus creatures that have that effect staple to them. One of the big knock-on effect is that removal is a lot worse when a lot of your creatures have enter the battlefield abilities, because now your Murder only removes some fraction of the value of that card they played. If they played the Ravenous Chupacabra, then they already got to kill one of your creatures, and they got their 2-for-1 because they killed one of your creatures, and you had to use a removal spell on that creature to get rid of it. So removal just gets quite a bit worse, and I think this is maybe a big part of what kept creatures in check in the early days of Magic, is that if you had a terror or whatever, that would just get rid of all of the value of any creature of any mana value, and so you couldn't afford
any creature.
The vast majority of creatures in early Magic that weren't
4/5
that
of the
weren't black
creatures.
or artifacts, sure, whatever. You know what I'm saying? So I think the fact that removal was relatively efficient. Like, I mean, terror has limitations and downsides, like a lot of old Magic cards did, but they still print removal spells at 2 mana. That's still like kind of the watermark for like an efficient removal spell. That hasn't changed all that much. But you just couldn't afford to play Crawworm back in the day if your opponent had terrors, because you get no value out of all that mana you invested if they just hit it with a terror. So I think that is a big side effect that cube designers especially should be very conscious of. You get to decide, as someone curating an environment, how good you want removal to be, and that decision largely comes down to how good is it to remove something. And if all your threats, or the vast majority of your threats, or all of your best threats all have really good ETBs, then the trade-off there is that removal spells become a much lower priority and much lower power level.
Yeah, the other big sort of pretty obvious effect is that games just involve a lot more rectangles on the table now, I think, than they used to, especially in the very early days of Magic, because a lot of things come on creatures, and then even a lot of things that don't have creature in the literal type line also make tokens, so games just tend to be about bigger, more complex boards.
Yep, there's definitely just more stuff going on when your effects are also attached to permanents that then sit and play and have to be tracked and accounted for. I think the last big difference I can think of right now is that the other thing you're doing by stapling an effect to a creature is, and this, power creep comes into play here, but still, relative to each individual era of Magic and the power level they were printing cards at, you're getting a less efficient body at that mana value because you're also getting an ability staple to it, right? Like, you don't want to pay 4 mana for a 2/2 in modern Magic, but Ravenous Chupacabra was perfectly playable because it had a really, really good end of the battlefield ability, and so you were playing 4 mana 2/2s. And we've talked on the show before about a trend that I see in a lot of pauper and peasant cubes, which is just tons of creatures with ETBs, and therefore everyone's still just playing 2/2s and 1/1s on like the 6th, 7th, and 8th turns of the game. And I think that can mean that a lot of times your games will just go on longer because you are not playing big threats that can really pressure your opponent and pressure their life total very quickly. You're instead playing things that are fundamentally more than a 1-for-1, right? Like, sure, a Mana War, I wouldn't really call a Mana War a 2-for-1 in the cleanest sense because you haven't actually removed a piece of cardboard from them. Like, the Unsummon is not really a 1-for-1 to me. but a Ravenous Chupacabra certainly is. All these things with ETBs, Elvish Visionaries 2 for 1, they're all going to give you this incremental value and leave you behind a less efficient than it could be threat that is not going to put relatively as much pressure on your opponent as a creature that didn't have that ability attached to it would. So you can end up in a situation, if you go really far in this direction, where everyone's just kind of bouncing, Mana Wars and Ravenous Chupacabras off each other, and nobody ever gets hit for more than 2 or 4 damage in combat because none of the creatures are that big, and it can be a kind of a sloggy, sort of long, drawn-out games that may or may not be your goal. And for a lot of people, that is their goal, right? Like, that also affords interesting, weird decks with weird value engines a lot of time to set up, and maybe that's what excites you about Magic, in which case you should prioritize creatures like this. If you really want life totals to matter and you want games to be relatively short, then I think there's a cost to be considered for creatures that have a bunch of ETBs.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. Just I'm trying to think through all the sort of cascade of knock-on effects, and having big creatures that are big threats will make your removal better, but also those big creatures might not be that good if a lot of your cards come with extra rectangles to put on the table because you have lots of chump blocks. So maybe as a cube designer, you want to make sure that your threats have trample or have some other kind of evasion. It's a complicated game.
It's definitely a complicated game. There's no doubt about it. The next big change that I can think of in this vein is we've seen a definite trend, and I would say this has been in the last decade, in like our era of playing Magic, a clear trend of moving from cards just having some kind of effect, whether it's a spell or a creature with an ETB, cards just doing something immediately, to cards creating a sort of trinkety artifact that then you can later pay some mana and sacrifice for that effect. So I'm talking anything that makes clue tokens, anything that makes blood tokens, anything that makes shard tokens, anything that makes food tokens, though I guess food is a little different because it just gains life for the most part, which is not as much of a sort of bread and butter effect, I think, as drawing cards or rummaging or whatever. But this is a type of card we see a lot now. We see tons of trinkety artifacts. I wouldn't put treasures in the same category because treasures don't require mana to activate, so you get to just use them immediately if you want to. So comparing like Manamorphose to a Manamorphose that makes a treasure, the treasure is a strict upgrade.
Something I would never do. Never try and make such a comparison.
The treasure is almost always a strict upgrade because you can just spend the mana immediately the same way except that spell made the mana, but now you can also carry it over turns if you want, which you couldn't do before. Whereas all these other trinket artifacts, it's a downgrade, right? Like making a clue is worse than just drawing a card immediately because now you got to pay 2 more mana to draw that. The same way making a blood is worse than just also having a rummage attached to your spell because you still have to pay mana and sacrifice that thing to get that effect.
Yeah, it's funny how this change also has a lot of this similar sort of cascading effects where, we used to have a lot of Elvish Visionaries, just a small creature enters the battlefield, you draw a card, and now we have a lot more Thraben Inspectors, which is a small creature that lets you draw a card, but with the extra steps of sacrificing your clue token. And again, that just means there's a lot more rectangles in play, there's a lot more things to trigger off of, there's just a lot more happening.
This is definitely the rectangles trend.
Contemporary
rectangles
Magic.
will be more.
It also just means there's a lot more potential decision points because you're not getting an entire effect all at once, but they're able to split the cost across multiple different activations, which has, I think, a lot of opportunities overall for cube designers.
Yeah, honestly, I feel like this, to me, and there are definitely spells that make food tokens and clue tokens, but I think for a lot of these effects, we see them attached to creatures because a lot of abilities are attached to creatures now. I feel like part of the rise of these kinds of effects is actually a response to the sort of knock-on effects of switching a lot of things to being on creatures on ETB, because Elvish Visionary is a perfect example of the kind of dirtily card that I was talking about earlier, where you don't want to play a 2-mana 1/1 in almost any format of Magic ever. So you're not really playing that for the 1/1 body, you're playing it to draw a card, but you also don't want to play 2-mana draw a card in any format of Magic ever, so you're kind of getting just like a very mediocre version of both these things, and you put it in your deck that cares about elves, or cares about having small creatures to sacrifice, or has ways to flicker stuff, right? Like, it's got a lot of opportunities for interaction, but the card itself is kind of unexciting, and you don't want it in like a random aggro deck. Meanwhile, Thraben Inspector, I think, is fantastic in an aggro deck because it's 1-drop. You get to deploy your threat on turn 1. It's not the most aggressive 1-drop because it's only got 1 power, but it does still brawl. You are attacking and blocking with your Thraben Inspector. Its body is relevant. And the reason they were able to do that is because they made the drawing a card have an additional cost you pay later. You couldn't just have 1-mana, 1/2 ETB draw a card. That would be busted in so many ways.
Or you could have 2 and a white for ETB draw a card on a 1/2, but that would just be a card that wouldn't make sense in a lot of these contexts. Or
yeah, a 3-mana Inspector where you have to like essentially crack the coup immediately would just be terrible. Like that's just not a good card by modern Magic card design standards. So I think that what this actually allows in a lot of cases is for you to play more on-curve creatures. Like these creatures have better power and toughness for the point of the game in which you're casting them, which means that you can put more pressure on your opponent's life total. You get to like keep the game moving while also not giving up all of the value and just, going back to pure Tarmogoyfs and Crawlworms where your creature's only value is attacking and blocking. It still comes with additional benefit, but that benefit is smaller and you got to pay for it more in the future.
Yeah, I want to say the biggest effect of this is just that if you're playing with a lot of these cards, we have both the benefit and the downside of increased complexity, and we also have a lot more opportunities for players to use their mana very efficiently, and so I think a lot of the game can become sort of about resource management in a way that maybe it isn't as much if you're playing with simpler creatures that just sit on the board and do their thing.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, these cards are definitely a lot more complicated, right? Like, Thraben Inspector makes a token. You now have to have another token. You now have to know the rules text of 2 individual cards. Like, it's not a very complicated card. Overall, it's pretty simple. And as these sort of trinket artifacts become very common, then they start to become just like, you don't have to be a very experienced Magic player to know what a clue token does. You learn that pretty quickly when you're playing Magic. Less so for, I don't even know what a shard token does sitting here today. Like, I know it's one of these trinkety artifacts. I can't remember for the life of me what it does.
There might only be like one card that makes shard tokens.
No, there's a couple.
There were a couple. I think that was
Nico
first it was Nico, and then it was a couple others. What about map tokens? Do you know what a map token does? Because
I do know what a map token does. I forgot about maps
struggle.
when I was making this list, but maps is a great example. Yeah, I mean, maps I think is pretty easy. Like, it's a question of do you know what Explore does?
Right.
Map tokens are very easy.
There are a lot of cards that don't have the reminder text for what a map token does, so that's definitely one that I see trips people up pretty often.
So they're definitely more complicated, for sure, than these things just having their effect immediately, but they also allow you to play more on-curve threats, which I think is, for my personal play preferences, pound for pound, an improvement. And I think that's why we see more of these things, is because I think R&D generally agrees that, like, yeah, it's not super fun to be playing 4-mana 1/2s and, 5-mana 2/2s with really good ETBs. It's actually a little more fun to be having good threats in play early and to have your life total matter and have the game be dynamic and sort of fast-paced. The other thing that you get from this, which I think is a big part of the reason we see R&D doing it a lot, is all of a sudden, your cards just have a lot more opportunities for interaction with other cards. So, I mentioned that these cards are it's always a downside to have to pay for your blood token versus a regular rummage, but that's not true if your deck has 4 copies of Mayhem Devil in it. Like, now all of a sudden, you get to sacrifice more stuff to your Mayhem Devil. Or, I think Blood Fountain, that card that's a 1-mana artifact that makes 2 blood tokens. My understanding is that card sees some play and constructed, not because anybody cares about blood tokens, but because it is a 1-mana card that makes 3 game pieces.
Card says 3 artifact.
Yeah.
Turns out, Darksteel Relic, not that good. A card that just says artifact is so-so, but a card that says 3 artifact, now we're getting somewhere.
Yeah, making 3 pieces of, material if your deck cares about reaching Ascend or having things in play to sacrifice to their sort of sack outlet or whatever just is pretty strong. So there are definitely ways you can turn these weird downsides into upsides, which is cool. Like, if your deck cares about artifacts, if it cares about sacrificing stuff, then these cards are not just simply the effect, but later and at attacks. You have figured out a way to make it a cool upside. And I think that is one of the biggest reasons R&D does this, is because it allows them to say, okay, here's a set that cares about artifacts. We can only print so many artifacts in the set because there's just limitations to, what artifacts can or should do in the game mechanically in sort of the color pie or the card type pie, as it were. And a way to get a bunch more artifacts in the set is to have a bunch of non-artifact cards, either spells or regular creatures, that just make these artifact tokens. And now we can have a really deep, broad artifact matters theme without having to fill the set with a bunch of cards with artifact on the type line.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, and I would maybe even go a little bit further just to say it doesn't really affect us as cube designers, but it absolutely affects people that are designing new Magic cards, that it just opens up a lot more design space. If I can cost things differently because I have the flexibility of putting some of the extra effect into a trinket artifact, or I just need to make a suite of new cards, and now I can take all the standard effects and staple a blood token to them, and now I have a new card for the new set, that just opens up a ton of design space.
Yeah, I like these. I will say, as a cube designer, ever vigilant for complexity, I think I like to include a reasonable density of cards that make a certain type of trinkety artifact. So I would be really hesitant to include one and only one card that made shard tokens, for example. But if I have 4, 5, 10 cards that make clue tokens or blood tokens, then I feel pretty good about it because those tokens will just be around the tables people are playing, and more importantly, you're more likely to know what the card does because you might have one in your own pool that makes that token, and so when your opponent plays something and makes that token, it's all sort of very clear.
It's funny you bring up the shard tokens because, there are a lot of cards that just make unique tokens. It's like, I'm
the junk token or whatever.
Tuck. I make my Explorer or whatever that card is. Like, it makes a legendary
Voja.
token that's just specific to this one card. Shard sounds like something that should be very generic in another one of these trinkety artifacts, but it is only on 2 cards so far. So I wonder if that's something that's been sort of seeded to be part of a theme in a future set.
Much worse example than map tokens then. I should have said map tokens. I just forgot about them.
You could go edit it.
It's so hard. I'm not going to. Now, as we go on, go down the line, we're going to get a little more detailed, I think, with the things we're talking about because we've kind of covered some of the big, broad changes. I think the last big, broad change that we see in card design is moving away from things that can target your own stuff or target you or your opponent to things that when the target is, let's say, 90% of the time going to be just one, just sort of forcing that issue. So repetitive example here is card draw. Most card draw used to be targeted. It said target player draws N cards. And that meant that you would mostly target yourself. Maybe a lot more than 90%. Maybe 98% of the time you target yourself. But every once in a while, your opponent would have no cards left in their library and it became a way to kill them. Or
turns out you can kill people with Ancestral Recall.
Yeah, or maybe you had a way to benefit off your opponent drawing cards that gave you some other sort of upside. And there'd be weird edge cases where you would actually want to target your opponent with the card draw. More sort of common, I think, is looking at Mana War, brought up a couple times already, versus Exclusion Mage. Mana War can target anything, which means that you can bounce your own creatures, you can bounce the Mana War itself. Exclusion Mage can target only your opponent's creatures, which means that, for the most part, that's what Mana War was doing. Of all the Mana Wars cast throughout time, I would argue probably 85% of them bounce your opponent's creature.
I would guess much higher.
Yeah, I do think that it is kind of a blink card, that you bouncing your own stuff. Not itself, but bouncing your own stuff is pretty somewhat of an edge case with that particular card. And this change, I think, pretty unambiguously is about making digital play more smooth. When you have to choose targets for everything, and a target is not just like a natural thing that happens as part of the casting of a spell, being able to misclick and accidentally target your opponent with the card draw, which wouldn't even need to be targeted if it didn't have the word target on it, or, have more options to choose from and when you're clicking around to choose targets for your Mana War. I think that is the biggest reason we see this happening for these particular cards.
I agree that now that's the biggest reason, but I think that trend actually goes back much further. I mean, Exclusion Mage was printed quite a while, I think, before Arena even existed.
I mean, Magic Online has been around since, 2000.
That's true. I wonder how much that actually influenced a lot of design. I think I
think the amount that it has influenced design has probably just sort of gone up linearly over time.
That's probably true.
As the applications have gotten more popular and more accepted as, a way to play competitive Magic and, where competitive Magic happens, I think it's just become more and more of an influence.
I think a bigger reason, though, is just, as designers, they want to cut off edge cases that usually don't matter, and especially with a card like Mana War, cut off potentially frustrating or confusing edge cases. Like, if your opponent doesn't have any creatures in play and you cast Mana War, you have to bounce something. Or if you cast
that one does
Necrotal,
suck.
If you cast Flametongue Kavu,
Necrotal can't target itself.
That's a great point. See how it's confusing? What's the one that I play in my cube? The Skin Render is a tricky one where it has to target something to put minus counters on it, and if that's your
Skin
only
Render is a
creature in
must,
play,
really.
Yeah.
I was going to say, because there are other ways you can do this, right? You could also make the ETB a May. You could say another creature, right? There's all kinds of little permutations of these effects, and we do still see some things that can target your own stuff. It's not like this has gone away completely, but for the most part in the early days, you had as many options as the ability could possibly allow for, including bouncing your own thing, which actually I think was probably not because Richard Garfield or the early Magic designers were thinking, let's make this as open-ended as it could be. It's because that's the cleanest way to write it. That's
right.
The fewest words to write the thing that you want that card to do, and maybe you didn't really think super hard about the fact that that means you can't play Mana War on an empty board now, but it's much cleaner than writing, a creature your opponent controls, or another creature, or May, right? It's just more words to add to sort of the soup. And so now we see almost all of these creatures are going to have some kind of affordance, whether it's a May, whether it's another, or whether it's only targeting your opponent's stuff. We've just kind of narrowed, for the most part, the scope of what these cards can do. And like you said, cut off edge cases, which I actually don't think is most of R&D's goal. I think edge cases are fun. That's a big part of what makes Magic exciting. I think when those edge cases are more likely to cause, if you were to like have some sort of omniscient view and be able to see every time the edge case on Man of War was cool and made the game better, and every time the edge case on Man of War was frustrating, confused somebody, caused a misclick on Magic Online, you'd have to ask yourself, as an R&D team, what ratio are we comfortable with here?
I'm just imagining the scene in X-Men where, they go into the sphere room.
I don't know the scene in X-Men.
They go into the sphere room and they're like, look, we can see the globe and here's all the X-Men. But I'm just imagining, like, what would your machine that could show you all of these like really unique instances be? It's just the Man of War did something cool machine is such it's not a thing we should build, but it would be cool to have.
But I think that's what the R&D team has to talk about in the abstract. They're like, all right, well, here's what we have to decide. How often is this mostly happening versus how often is it causing some kind of logistical problem?
I think there's also part of it that it just makes the cards more understandable. Even if there's more words on it, you, as a novice Magic player, might read Man of War and be like, why do I want to put a creature back into somebody's hand? But if it says put your opponent's creatures, it's much clearer what you're going to do with that card.
I thought about that, but I don't know how much.
I think in more
that feels like
cases,
building a straw man a little bit. Like,
well, they might be building the same straw man, in which case mine is accurate.
I'm going to give them credit and assume that they're not doing that, but it's possible. In very complex cases, I can imagine maybe that coming up, but for the most part, I think even the most novice of player would be like, of course I want you to put your creature back in your hand. Like, that's obvious. Now, what they wouldn't get, a new player, is that they can't play Man of War on an empty board, because they would assume, of course I want to put my opponent's creature back. They would not think of the edge case. Like,
right.
Bouncing your opponent's creature is so self-evident that they wouldn't think to bounce their own creature. They would miss their own edge case, and they would also miss the fact they can't play it on an empty board. Like,
I mean, there are more complex instances of this. Like you mentioned, Kiki Jiki says non-legendary, and there are plenty of edge cases where you'd be like, yeah, I want to copy my legendary creature to get a trigger on something, but it would force you to sacrifice. And I was talking to a new player just last week who kept trying to clone their legendary creatures and was so confused. Why was Arena just making them discard their cards? So these things happen.
Yeah, I think Kiki Jiki is a good example, actually. Like, I think they looked at the X-Men sphere of all the sort of possible edge cases of Kiki Jiki and said, like, yeah, sure, sometimes your legendary thing has an enter the battlefield ability. Like, you do want to copy it, even though you immediately have to sacrifice the state-based actions. And they said, but also, how many times is somebody at F&M going to accidentally target their legendary creature and then be told, oh, yeah, you have to sacrifice it immediately and proceed with the turn now that you've just wasted that ability. So
now they just solve that problem by saying, if it's legendary, don't worry about it.
Don't get me started on that.
That's a big, I mean, we could put that on our list.
But that's more of us.
That's trying to solve the problem that Commander made.
Yeah, I mean, I can't picture a cube designer trying to compare, like, wow, should I put things in here that actually care about the legend rule or that ignore the legend rule? Like, most cubes are singleton. It's not a thing most people are going to be thinking about, so it's whatever. Anyway, here, I think, to bring us back to our, like, cube designer who's deciding which kinds of effects to put in their cube. Do I put Mana War in my cube? Do I put Exclusion Mage in my cube?
One of them is a cool jellyfish. The other is a weird-looking guy.
I mean, that could be something that matters for a lot of people. I think the biggest consideration for you here is, what is your intended audience? If you want this to be a cube that you intend to have a bunch of players that have not seen these specific cards before playing, you're trying to grow your play group, you're inviting new people in every week, then yeah, I would maybe be circumspect about including, maybe not, I mean, Man of War itself is pretty iconic at this point, that I would expect there to be fewer issues with this, but there's plenty of cards that I'm not going to come to the top of my head right now that you have this option of one that can target anything versus one that can only target the thing that you're going to do most of the time. And if you care about that new player experience and making this more friendly and approachable, then I think the Exclusion Mage category is what you should be going for. And if you care more about weird edge cases and depth of decision making and, you know, making this an opportunity for expression of skill because you found that sort of one moment where actually you should be bouncing your own creature, then the things that can target anything are probably worth it. Also worth noting, like, some people do play their cubes digitally. If you are, then these cards, I think, are largely printed this way for digital ease of use, so you should consider that for sure if you could plan to play your cubes digitally. Whereas if you're in paper, it doesn't really matter.
Fair.
Now we're getting specific, Anthony. A trend I have noticed a lot of in the past 5-ish years. We've certainly seen more equipment be printed since equipment came out in Mirrodin. Equipment was kind of like a sometimes food for a while, and then now we see equipment in basically every set, and I think in higher numbers and higher densities. And I think the reason we see it more is because nowadays equipment very often either creates a token on ETB and attaches that equipment to the token, so the equipment is also a creature, which is actually very similar to our first example in this episode of effects that are just effects versus effects that are also creatures, or we see equipment that attaches itself on ETB to a target creature. So the first equip is basically free.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I was the snap-on equipment that automatically equips the first time. That's very clear. I think we've just seen that more and more, and it makes a lot of sense, to be honest, to me, because I think it's really difficult to balance an equipment in a way where it has these two costs, but the first time you want it, you have to pay the full cost up front. And I think that a lot of the snap-on equipment, the equip costs end up being pretty high, but that ends up still feeling like a pretty balanced card, and you're mostly playing it for the one equip and then a little bit of extra in case you end up with a lot of mana late in the game. The point about equipment also just doing a lot of other stuff is interesting, and that feels parallel to creatures getting overloaded and basically having spells attached to them. That is true of a lot of equipment in recent sets as well, where it'll, just this turn give a creature hexproof, or give it flying, or give it indestructible, or maybe it deals some damage when it enters the battlefield. So it's like the same kind of adding more spell effects to permanence.
Yeah, no, I think equipment has definitely followed the same pattern, right? You go back to Mirrodin, and the equipment is like, you pay to cast it, you pay to equip it, it does the thing, right?
Which was almost always just make it bigger.
Yeah, I mean, there's some edge cases where there were equipment that did more complicated stuff, but a lot of it was just, make the thing bigger, basically. I think the equipment that it snaps on, that attaches on ETB, is brilliant, and I would go so far as to say that I think if you tasked modern R&D with remaking equipment from the ground up, they would probably make that how the equipment card type works. You just get the first equip automatically, and then the equip cost is the cost to move it in the future to other creatures. Because it's such a more intuitive play pattern in some ways, and it also allows you to, like you said, balance the equipment much more reasonably, because having to pay the full casting cost and the full equip cost before you get any benefit off of that equipment means that it's really hard to make equipment that then isn't just trivially easy to move around for free with really low equip costs, which does add weird complexity that maybe isn't the most fun, right? Like, I think the kind of compulsory attack with my Bone Splitter, then move my Bone Splitter to my blocker kind of like play pattern is maybe not the most fun. When you compare something like Marauder's Axe versus Scavenged Blade, which there's also color considerations there, but you're talking about a card that snaps on ETB, so it's like kind of plays like an aura, with then not having the downside of once your creature is removed, that aura is just gone forever, but instead having it become a pretty bad card. Now you got to pay a lot of mana to equip it to something else, but it's just a much better, sort of healthier play pattern.
I think that's a big point, and probably, I'm speculating a little bit here, but one of the reasons they didn't do the snap-on initially is they just wanted it to feel pretty distinct from auras, because they're trying to make a new card type.
Yeah, I think that's probably the case. But to your point, I do think we are seeing them get kind of overloaded now with more stuff, and at some point, all the stuff just becomes the same stuff, right? Like, if all of your creatures and equipments are all entering the battlefield and destroying things and dealing damage and drawing cards, like, at what point does the card type even really matter anymore?
Yeah, I think that's like a big sort of meta shift that I hadn't really thought about, but definitely makes sense to me, that older Magic, maybe they were more concerned about making sure that things felt distinct, and it doesn't feel that important anymore. It's like, here's your Planeswalker. Grist, also a bug. Don't worry about it.
And also a creature.
Yeah,
you can Green Sun Zenith for your Planeswalker.
No
it's
problem.
Fine. You can reanimate it. Yeah, this is not the conversation to talk about that. Maybe we'll talk about it in the future, but I mean, like, Colored Artifacts is a great example of that too, right? Like, in a lot of ways makes a lot of sense, but also, like, what is an artifact now? It's just a thing that you can destroy with a disenchant that you otherwise couldn't. Like, I don't know. It definitely is muddying the waters of the sort of clear delineations of what different cards and card types do.
Is that a problem?
Tell us in the comments down below. So that's equipment that snaps on. You and I both, I think, are kind of fans of the play patterns of a lot of equipment that makes a token and equips itself automatically. I'm talking about your Barb Spikes, your Ancestral Blades, that kind of stuff. Talk to me about those play patterns for those cards, because I think on their face, those are complicated cards that involve a token. They make the board more complicated. There are things you might sort of eschew, and yet you play a lot of these cards. So what are the advantages of those particular patterns for you?
I mean, I think it's exactly what you said earlier about just making a card that is fairly simple in its base case, but has a lot of opportunity for complex depth. You know, your Ancestral Blade is just a 2-mana 2/2, but when it dies, you can put this sword on something else. Or even before it dies, you can move stuff around. It adds multiple rectangles to the table, which is relevant for a lot of decks. It is technically not a creature, which a lot of cards might care about casting non-creature spells. So I do think that even though that's like a fairly complex design and does come with a fair amount of baggage, I think a lot of those designs are just really fun to play with.
I do think the base case of equipment that does nothing, you play it, you equip it, It's kind of really swingy in the same way that like just big beefy creatures in early Magic were swingy. Either your opponent has a removal spell or they don't, and if they don't, then you just beat their face in with a Sarah Angel, and there's not really any recourse. A card that I have been on the fringe of cutting from the Bun Magic Cube for a long time is Umezawa's Jite, which I don't think is overpowered. I, if anything, think it underperforms people's expectations in that cube, just because there is so much interaction. It's fairly common for your opponent to play 2 mana to play it, pay 2 mana to go to equip it, and either in response to that, go to equip, or when they go to combat, you just kill the creature it's equipped to, and then they go to equip it again, and you kill that creature, and then they've spent now 8 mana on the thing before they actually get to get any benefit out of it, which is a big downside. And on the flip side, if you don't have that removal, if you're playing blue-green and they get it under a counterspell, then it can be very powerful and very potent, and that really high polarity on that card is largely due to the fact that it doesn't have an ETB, it doesn't make a token, it doesn't snap on, you just gotta play it, equip it, and then you get the full benefit. And in the Bun Magic Cube, I think it is around 4 mana worth of benefit, 4 to 6 mana worth of benefit, but it's just got a very on or off kind of texture to it, which is maybe not always the most fun.
You just gotta add the auto-equip text. Just make Umezawa's Jite playable again.
I mean, if it had the auto-equip text, but cost 4 mana or 3 mana, and then, you know, the equip cost was also higher, I think that would be a better designed Magic card, to be honest.
Yeah, I don't know if how to make Umezawa's Jite a better Magic card is a can of worms we need to open today.
Yeah, let's not go there. All right, our grand finale. Let's talk about the whenever this creature attacks versus whenever you attack difference. This was the little spark that lit the fire under this whole episode, and we've been mentioning them on the podcast a whole bunch, but we got to give a shout out to Ollie. Ollie Beeks went on a little tirade on Twitter a couple months ago now about how much they didn't like the new Alesha, the sort of gold black-red Alesha, and their main point of disagreement or distaste for this card was that this Alesha has a whenever you attack trigger compared to the original Alesha from the Khans block, which cared about Alesha herself attacking. And Ollie's sort of presupposition was that this meant that the creature didn't have to get into combat, didn't have to risk itself, and that was, you know, worse for their particular tastes.
I think another really clear example of this change is something like Brimaz, which is a creature that when it attacks, it makes a token, and Adeline Resplendent Cathar, that just when you attack with anything makes a token.
That's the cleanest example I could think of, where those cards are very similar. Mm-hmm. They do have other differences, right? Like Brimaz makes a token when it blocks, and Adeline's power is variable instead of a fixed number. But for the most part, those cards are very similar, except for this particular rules difference of whenever Brimaz attacks versus whenever you attack with anything.
Although it's funny, I feel like you can just attack with Adeline so often that maybe it doesn't matter as much in this comparison. But
well, to be honest, I'm not. Maybe if you're interested in this, we can talk about it. I'm not that interested in like unpacking Ollie's particular criticism of like whether or not this is worse or, you know, somehow toxic or something. I'm just interested in talking about the differences in these two different types of wordings, because I think there's a lot of interesting gameplay differences between them, and there are reasons you might prioritize one or the other that don't come down to just, do you want to play the more powerful card? Because Adeline is the more powerful card in the Adeline-Brimaz comparison. I don't think it's particularly controversial to say that, but I think a big part of that is that Adeline also just gets huge. So much more huger than Brimaz does, that it can be a much more efficient, self-contained threat than Brimaz can be. So let's talk about it. Most creatures that have a whenever this creature attacks trigger, I mean, some can have haste or flash, but for the most part, you're basically waiting to get the value out of that creature. You've played it, and now you have to wait a whole turn cycle for combat to come around again before you can actually get the benefit off of it. I think the primary difference between those creatures and ones that say whenever you attack are that the whenever you attack ones, you get to get that immediately if you already had a board built up. If you already had a creature in play that you're willing to attack with, you know, your Inti Seneschal of the Sun or your Adeline Resplendent Cathar can get a trigger immediately the turn you play it.
Right, so in some ways it is clearly just a strict power upgrade because it just gives you more flexibility and, yeah, can happen a turn sooner in most cases.
Yeah, it is. This is one of the rare examples where I think we can say this is a strict power upgrade because it is still going to trigger whenever the thing itself attacks. Somebody's going
to be like, oh, but what if your opponent plays a clone and then there's some way that...
What if your opponent plays a clone? Is not... Yes, they cloned a better card. It's still the better card.
That makes it worse.
No, that's not how that works. But yeah, I think that timing, it is a power upgrade for sure. But like, this is my point to Ollie. Now we're getting into it. I didn't mean to. Is that You can complain about the power level of these cards, but like that doesn't speak to the implicit design of the mechanic, right? Like we can still compare Adeline and Brimaz. If Adeline costs 5 mana and Brimaz costs 3, there Adeline is a much worse card because now it costs 5, but it still has this immediate value when you play it. If you have a creature in play, you can already attack with it. Or just make Adeline, 1/2 or a 2/3 instead of a X4. And you can still have this conversation of like, let's put power level aside, because just because this ability is a strict power upgrade does not mean that the card is always going to be way better necessarily than a similar card that was printed with different wording. That's a sort of complaint about the whole package, not this particular mechanic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the real difference, if we just say, okay, let's ignore all the numbers, ignore how that translates into power level, the real difference in terms of gameplay is just that if it triggers when you attack with anything, it doesn't require you to necessarily risk that resource and actually be attacking with that one creature your opponent can block and kill in combat, which I see in a lot of ways as a little bit of a downside, because I think that forcing players to actually make a choice and make an investment in the fact that you want to get this trigger and risking your creature in combat, risking the option to have that effect in the future, is an interesting decision a lot of the time.
See, I don't know if I agree with you there. I think this is following a trend we've observed in a lot of the other mechanics or sort of patterns we've talked about of kind of like evening things out a little bit. Because when you have a Brimaz or, a card that gets a benefit when it attacks, it's either on or off. Either it's not doing the thing, you're not getting the ability at all, or you get to attack with it and it's getting the ability, and usually it means you're in a great position because you are getting both those things. You're getting to attack and you're getting the ability itself. By introducing this slight variation to that wording of saying whenever you attack at all, now instead of getting to choose, do I risk this exact creature for this ability, you get to decide, do I want to risk any of my creatures for this ability? You still have to risk something. It's not that you don't have to risk anything at all. You still need to be in a position where you want to attack, but now you can say, is it worth just trading this 1/1 token, even though it's just going to get blocked and eaten, for a trigger of this ability? And that means that there are many more board states where you get to sort of navigate an interesting decision space of whether you get that ability or not, compared to just, do I attack or not with my thing, and that kind of being an all-in proposition.
I see what you're saying. I feel like it's kind of a weird thing where Mark Rosewater talks about variance being specifically just how many things can a card do. More things is more variance, which is not exactly how most people describe it, but that's what I'm talking about here. And it feels like there's some middle space where there's the most texture, there's the most tension, there's the most interesting decisions. And as you add more variance and a card can do more things, it kind of just collapses into noise almost. And it's like, well, now nothing really mattered, because even though this board state could have functioned different ways, like Adeline has more variance because I can attack with more different creatures than Brimaz, which only does one thing. Adeline actually ends up feeling more the same more often because it's more consistently just going to trigger every single combat. Does that make any sense?
I kind of get what you're getting at, but I don't think that is how this is going to play out most of the time. Like, for example, I think the Modern Alesha, can you get the card name for me, the black-red one? I think that card is brilliantly designed. I think it is honestly a much better design in terms of texture of gameplay for the kinds of Magic games I want to play than the original Alesha, which requires you to be able to untap with your 2 toughness 3 drop and be able to attack with it to get any value out of it. If you are doing that, you are winning the game. You are crushing your opponent. You're running away with things. It's snowballing. And if you're not, then your card did nothing. Whereas the Modern Alesha has so many more ways it can be useful in varying degrees, and also other ways your opponent can interact with it in varying degrees that, is it worth a removal spell for that thing if you can't afford to attack with it? Let's say I have a big creature, I get to, have my big blocker such that you can't afford to attack with your own Alesha who laughs at fate, but you're like making a token every turn and you're just like throwing away to get one of these triggers. Now I get to ask the question, is my removal spell worth you not getting this kind of, middling trinkety trigger every turn? Or do I, save that for something bigger and more impactful? Versus, obviously you have to remove the thing if they're getting to attack with it. Or if you have the blocker, they can't attack with it and you effectively already have removed it. I'm babbling now, but I agree with your idea in theory. I just don't think in practice.
Sure, okay.
The introduction of whenever you attack compared to whenever this attacks is actually going to fundamentally mean that all of that complex decision space is just collapsed, because I think you do find yourself in board states where you actually have to make those decisions. It's not like it's just
Sure.
a foregone conclusion.
How about we just say we can acknowledge that not being forced to attack with a specific creature to get that whatever effect it is means you don't have to put up the same investment. Like, there's not necessarily that same tension. Whether or not that is better or worse in terms of having fun gameplay and introducing interesting decisions is going to really, really vary from card to card depending on everything else that's going on with it.
Yeah, it's also just weird to, like, why just because a creature has an attack trigger should you have to risk it? Like, you wouldn't say that, like, any creature with an activated ability, like, well, why can you activate this ability without attacking?
You should roll a dice, and if you get a 1, it should die.
Right, like
all activated abilities.
Yeah, like, I mean, it just doesn't make, like, the only reason Ollie or people would have that complaint is because they're directly comparing it to another kind of card that happens to be worded kind of similarly, but we have to accept that whenever you attack triggers are totally different. They're closer to, like, activated abilities than they are to, like, a thing that supposedly risks the creature, and they're designed and balanced as such, right? Like,
Sure.
you should get a more powerful effect if you have to risk the creature to attack. My point is that if you take some theoretical, platonic creature we're describing here that has some mana value, it has some power toughness, if you give that creature a strong ability whenever it attacks, and you have to risk it to get that strong ability, that is a much more binary sort of high variance play pattern than giving it a less powerful trigger that triggers whenever you attack. And whether we are complaining that modern creatures do too much and they have too much going on and the power level is just crept inherently, okay, fine. That's a separate argument we can have. But I don't think there's any argument that if the same R&D team was sitting down to make the same creature, they would obviously make the triggered ability whenever this thing attacks more powerful, because that's a riskier proposition. I think having the relatively less powerful trigger that triggers whenever you attack allows for a lot more interesting dynamic gameplay. And also it means you have to have a deck that has small creatures in it so that you can already have something in play to attack with if you want to actually benefit from that in a meaningful way. Like, it's also kind of a build around in a small way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that polarity, that, like, extreme difference between, you were able to attack with your creature that had a really powerful trigger even though you had to risk it, like, I think that can be really fun when you have to build your deck in a certain way to maximize that. Like, make sure you have lots of removal so you can clear blockers and really work to make that work. And similarly, I mean, to totally throw, like, comparing specific numbers out the window, another card I noticed when thinking about this was Battle Rattle Shaman, which is just a creature that gives one of your other creatures +2 power every combat. And that's kind of in the same space as...
Does that one have to attack or not?
And it doesn't. It's just like, this happens. One of your creatures gets bigger. And again, it's like that can lead to fun, interesting gameplay and deck building decisions when it's like, oh yeah, I want to put this in a deck with a bunch of tokens so I can keep throwing 3/1s at my opponent, and they have to figure out what to do about this while I'm not risking my Battle Rattle Shaman, but I still had to make the investment of building my deck a certain way. So yeah, I mean, I think that where we are landing is... it really just comes down to individual cards and what kind of work you have to do to make them work.
Yeah, for sure. And I think some people look at the Brimaz Adeline comparison and are like, oh, I think Adeline's too powerful, playing against it sucks. It must be because it has this reworded trigger. And in actuality, I would argue that
part of it.
I think it's a very tiny part of it, because in the case of Adeline, when you're getting beat by that card, it is attacking you every turn and it has 8 power. Like, that is the problem with Adeline. Like, nobody's ever complained that, gosh, my opponent gets to attack me with a token and get another token every turn, but leave their Adeline back because I have such a beautiful board of blockers. Like, that's not where Adeline is a problem. Adeline is not a problem there.
I mean, maybe the real problem is just vigilance. I mean, talk about a mechanic that requires no investment. It's vigilance.
That's a great time to remind people to go check out our Evergreen Keyword Tier List episode, where we talk about Evergreen Keyword abilities and their impact on gameplay. Let's make sure this episode and that episode have the same tag. I don't know what tag it should be, but some kind of tag should link these episodes.
We gotta work on those tags a little bit.
I keep thinking about it, and I'm going to be working on it in my head. I'm going to doodle it on it. And then I'll start working on it in reality when I start. It'll be an evolving thing.
That just reminds me of a podcast I was listening to about basket weavers and how he just needed to sit and think about the basket for a while before he could start. And that was part of the process.
That's a lot of my creative process, if I'm perfectly honest. There's a lot of just thinking about the thing before I do it. And then sometimes I do it and people are like, how'd you do it so fast? I'm like, well, I was thinking about it for so long. You have no idea. Like, this is not like some magic trick. I was just eating
snacks. Like, no.
It's not some magic trick I do. I was actually doing a lot of work.
Snacks might have been part of it.
I was doing a lot of quiet internal work in my brain. Calls to action, everybody. A couple things. Number one, I want to talk about more of these kinds of changes and patterns over time, and I'm sure there are dozens that we have not thought of. So comment down below, mention us on social media if you have another kind of, especially detailed. I'm more interested in the detailed ones, like, the equipment that snaps on or changes from whenever this creature attacks to whenever you attack. I want to talk about these specific sort of very detailed changes in patterns. So mention some of those to us so we can make a list, and once we get a list long enough, we'll record another episode in this vein. I also want to shout out upcoming Cube events. We have continued to add a bunch to luckypaper.co/events, which we'll link in the show notes. And I want to specifically call out the Upkeep event in New York, which is coming up in February. That one still has some seats left. And look, New York is such a big city. You should be able to sell out a small Cube event in that city handily. So if you're up in like Harlem or, whatever, and you don't want to go down to Brooklyn because it feels like it's a lifetime away, just go to this event. New York has got 13 million people. You should be able to fill that event. So I know we got a lot of listeners there. Check out the Upkeep event specifically in New York and the other events on our events page. Last thing I'll mention is that we do have our book club episode coming up in the near-ish future. I'm almost finished the book. I did get a couple notes from people mentioning that there was a free PDF of this book out there.
Oh, really?
I'm going to verify before I publish this episode that is intentional and not some sort of rogue distribution, some piracy going on. As long as the author is intended for this to be available for free, I will link that PDF in the show notes. And so if you want to read a PDF instead of a physical book, you don't want to buy it, then you can do that to follow along with the book episode when we record it, it's the book Playing Oppression, which is about the colonialism in board games and tabletop games, which will be coming up sometime soonish. Who knows?
My copy is still back-ordered, so maybe not super soon.
Wait, you still haven't gotten it?
Still haven't.
Oh, well, you can borrow mine.
I can borrow
pretty
yours
soon. It's not a terribly long read. Also, do you want to mention anything, Anthony?
Welcome to my accountability segment. You can go read my article about how to shuffle a cube right now on luckypaper.co. I've spent a lot of time thinking, just like you're describing, just thinking about how cards move around if you shuffle them, and then actually writing a lot of simulations to verify that my intuition made any sense. And I think most importantly, I just have some suggestions on how to shuffle a cube in a way that is both efficient and pretty deterministic, so you can just know when your cube is shuffled confidently.
Yeah. You spent a lot of time in your head and also time writing code about this. You've gone very, very deep. I've been wanting you to publish this article forever because I've been to multiple Cube events where people are doing the stupid pass left thing, and I'm like, no, don't do that. And they're like, but why?
I mean, the pass left thing is much better than the, just do whatever method, which is really, really ineffective, it turns out.
But you've gone overboard. So if you really want to see a sane, normal man's deep dive on how to shuffle a cube, instead of just saying, hey, put it in a couple piles and then shuffle it, then do it again, you're like, here's some simulations.
Sane and normal.
But your article gives off big vibes of multiple people have told you that you don't need to shuffle that way, and you're really trying to prove them wrong with beyond a shadow of a doubt.
I don't know. Maybe you haven't read the latest edit. I think we softened it up a little bit, made it a little more.
Oh, I'm not arguing it should be softer. I just mean that all of the apparent effort that went into it kind of communicates that invisibly.
Okay, yeah, that's fair.
Anyway, check out the shuffling article. It's good, and then always shuffle your cube that way, and then tell everyone else to do the same. If the next cube,
tell me I'm wrong, but before you tell me I'm wrong, you have to do two things for me. You have to read all the footnotes and then build simulations. Two things of similar effort.
A perfect way to insulate ourselves from criticism. Yes, you must do a bunch of work. Yeah, at the next CubeCon, I want to see everybody shuffling every cube this way. If I see any nonsense, it means we've not had a far enough reach.
Okay, I will put one caveat or limitation on, it is a little bit more difficult to coordinate, so if people want to assist in how do you make this method work with 4 or 6 people, that would be helpful.
Oh, I think it's easy. It gets hard when you have too many people because then you just can't coordinate them, but right. I think if you just assign one person per pile,
this is what I kind of want to do I would love to see at Cube events is if you are very good at shuffling, you can just shuffle a lot of cards at once, you should get a little badge that says designated shuffler. And then if you are somebody that knows how to coordinate a group of people to shuffle, you should get a different badge that says
I have small hands, but a big brain.
Shuffling coordinator. And then you can just look around the pod and be like, okay, you 4 are going to be in charge of shuffling and you're doing the coordination. Great job. I don't know if this is a serious idea, but I kind of like it.
I do not think that just your base method started with 4 piles. I think maybe it's 5 now or whatever. I think you just have that many people, each give them a pile, and the method is you must then divide your pile evenly amongst all shufflers.
Yes.
And then do it again. That's pretty easy to describe. It's just going to be hard, if you have 8 people and you're like, all right, divide your pile into eighths, like,
and pass them around, that just takes too long. Anyway,
it's
go enjoy
much
the
faster than
article,
one person
shuffle
doing
your
it.
cube. True.
Like, people just have to accept that the time passing cards is not time wasted. It feels like it's taking a
great
long
point.
time because you're passing cards around, but that is the shuffling. That is also shuffling. You sitting there riffling cards over and over again is not shuffling beyond 3 or 4 of those.
Right.
Passing the cards is the shuffling.
I think that's a really good message to end on. The time spent passing cards is not time wasted.
Wow, really makes you think. And on that bombshell, that's the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. The first episode of 2025. I hope everybody is having a good new year. I hope if you're living in Southern California, you're all right. Things are bad out there, folks. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This podcast is produced by thinking really hard about Magic cards and how to shuffle them and speaking to microphones about it. Anthony, thank you for the gift of friendship and for the gift of Cube.
Thank you for spending time passing cards with me. That wasn't time wasted.
It wasn't.